I bring my Bible, but everything that I am going to speak of, I've already got in my notes, but it's just important to have it, isn't it? And I also want to just quickly speak to this whole theme of our voice mattering. And you're going to hear what sounds like a cold in my voice, but I do not have a cold. Interestingly enough, right before I decided to run as a member of Parliament, I had a surgery. And the surgery was very successful. And one of the issues that they told me about was that perhaps my vocal cords could be damaged as a result of the surgery. And I woke up from the surgery, and lo and behold, my voice was just fine. But over time, we've come to realize now that there is a little bit of damage. So please, I think it's just been hitting me really strongly about how our voice matters. And so I trust that you can get past the hoarseness of my voice and hear what I want to share with you this morning. What an awesome way to start a weekend in July. I think this is incredible. And I know that many of you were here last Saturday to be here to try and understand our purpose just a little more clearly and to step into what God is doing by perhaps asking Him, how can I participate in what it is you are doing? I know that the leadership of Sisterhood has been praying for each one of you as they began to plan this morning so many months ago, and I had the opportunity to meet with the leadership, and as they prayed and we met and then spent more time in prayer, I believe God gave them the theme of waking up, wake up. And these two words, I would have to say, have been reverberating in my head for the past number of years. And for the first half of those years, I would have to share with you that I struggled. I struggled to open my eyes, struggled to come out of what I would describe as a grogginess, sort of like being woken up in the middle of REM, that rapid eye movement sleep where you're in the middle of a dream and you get woken up and it's really hard to wake up. And so I felt like I was in that state for so long. But then waking up to finally come to the realization of a few truths. And I have woken up, and I find myself waking up every day to ask the question, God, what is it you are doing, and how can I participate? As Caitlin said, I am a member of Parliament. I'm a member of Parliament representing a riding here in Saskatchewan, Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek, and it is a rural riding that is equal to half the size of the province of Nova Scotia. So I get to spend a lot of time on the road, and it wraps itself around the city of Saskatoon on three sides. And so I think there's something a little significant about that in terms of our relationship. I have had the privilege of serving as a member of Parliament, a Conservative member. I'll put that out there. I'm a Conservative member of Parliament, and I've been a member of Parliament for almost 11 years, and I'm currently serving as the Shadow Minister for Transportation in Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. But more importantly, I am a child of God. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a grandmother to 10 beautiful grandchildren, so I feel very blessed. When I was asked to present or speak to you this morning, I always find it tremendously hard to do that as I look back over the 11 years that I've served, to try and distill down my experience and perhaps what I've learned into something that I can articulate efficiently and meaningfully in the time that we have together. So given the challenge, my goal this morning is to share a little bit with you about myself, give you some ideas, as Caitlin has said, in terms of how you can engage in what is happening politically and why I think that it is important that you do. So I'm going to do this within the context of a number of questions, and these questions were developed as I met with Caitlin and Shar, and we were trying to flesh out what this talk would look like. And so questions like, what is our role and our responsibilities? Do our voices matter? Can we be change makers in our country? How much are we affected by the decisions that are made at a national level of politics? Why is it important to speak up as Christians in our nation? How can we stand together as the church to be a collective Christian voice? And how do we stand up for our rights and freedoms? I want to share with you a story, and I call this story Up Close and Personal with the Person's Case. And it's a personal story. Once I was sworn in, and all of the members of Parliament were sworn in back in 2008, there was an orientation being held for members of Parliament. We all headed to Ottawa, where we began to, I guess, get the lay of the land, so to speak. And at one point, we were all gathered in Centre Block, and that's the large building that's in the middle, the center of Parliament Hill. That's why it's called Centre Block, I imagine. And we were all lining up to have our pictures taken. And it was then that I decided to head to the washroom to make sure that my picture was going to look okay. And I didn't know the building. I was new on the hill. So I stopped a security guard who happened to be a female. And I asked her, where might I find a washroom? And she was very helpful. And as we were walking down this very long hall, she turned to me and she said, you know, there aren't very many washrooms for women in Centre Block, as when it was built, women weren't considered persons. And that was perhaps the first time that I had stopped to consider the evolution of our society here in Canada. And I say thank goodness for the famous 5 who made it possible for women to run for office and to be appointed to the Senate. Now, how many of you are familiar with the famous 5? Okay, I see one hand. These were 5 women from Alberta, all extraordinary women in their own right, doing amazing things. They created a petition asking the Supreme Court of Canada to answer the question, does the word persons in Section 24 of the British North America Act, which was created in 1867, include female persons? The 5 women were Emily Murphy, Irene Pearlby, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Edwards. And they fought to have women legally considered persons so that women could be appointed to the Senate. They filed their petition on August 27th in 1927. However, 1 year later, on April 24th, 1928, Canada's Supreme Court summarized its unanimous decision that women were not such persons. This case is known as the Persons Case. And although Canadian women had the vote in many provinces and in federal elections by 1929, this case was part of a continent-wide drive for political equality. And thankfully, the judgment was overturned by the British Judicial Committee of the Privy Council on October 18th, 1929. I just want to back up a little bit, say a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Saskatoon. I am the second of 5 children, a middle daughter. I think birth order matters, and sometimes being the middle daughter can put you in a place that's rather interesting. My dad was a mechanic, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and so I grew up in what would be referred to as a blue-collar neighborhood. I did not play organized sports, except those that were required at school. I was an average student. I did take all the maths and sciences because I thought that I might become an architect or maybe even a pediatrician. Those were the things that were on my radar. Politics was definitely not on my radar. But you know what? It was on my father's radar, and even though he was not actively involved with a political party, he followed the news and paid attention to all things political. And through our conversations at the kitchen table, I learned not only about my rights, as a citizen, but my responsibilities as well. Thank you. Now we'll see if I can, oh, you even opened it for me. Thank you. So, to answer the question, do our voices matter? And can we be change makers in our country? I think the story I just shared with you about the famous 5 would demonstrate that our voices do matter and that we can be change makers without holding public office, without perhaps being in a role like Queen Esther, perhaps without being in a role like Sir Winston Churchill. In order to answer the question, are we affected by decisions that are made at the national level of politics? Well, I would suggest to you that I would share with you the different orders or levels of government have jurisdiction over different services and programs that affect the lives of the citizens they serve. Your responsibility as a citizen is to familiarize yourself with not only those services and programs, but who it is that is representing you at those different tables. I think at the very least we need to understand where we live and how we got here. How is it that we are a country that not only promotes, but defends the values of human rights, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, both here at home and around the world? And what does that mean for us today? These are all questions we should be asking ourselves. We live in an amazing province, in what I think is the best country in the world, and we really shouldn't take that for granted. We all studied the history of this great nation as we were going through elementary school and high school, and we all studied our political system. But that was a long time ago for me. And so I'm imagining for some of you, you might not remember everything that you learned about our country and its history or our political system. So I think what we need to do now at this time in our lives is to find out, as I said, who your elected representatives are at the municipal level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level. Someone mentioned that there are community associations, and there are in every community in Saskatoon. That's a great place to get connected into what is happening in your community and to start to make your voice heard in terms of what you'd like to see happening in your community and in the larger community of the city of Saskatoon. I think it would be important for each one of you to contact your representatives, if only to introduce yourself and to have a conversation with them. I hear from constituents daily. I hear from them through email. I get phone calls. I receive letters. And I have a staff that have served my constituents very well in terms of putting all of that communication in front of me. And whether they have an issue where they need help, whether they just want to share a concern with me, whether they've read something in the news and they want to get perhaps the other side of the story, or whether they just have an idea for me as a member of Parliament, I do call them back. I respond to my constituents in the way that they have chosen to communicate with me. And as I said earlier, I am a Conservative member of Parliament. But there are electoral district associations in every riding of every party. So I make no assumptions that everybody in this room attaches themselves to the Conservative Party. I never make that assumption when I am speaking to a group of people. So there's another way of connecting into what's happening politically. Find out, who it is that represents most closely your values, your principles, those things that govern your thoughts and your actions, and then determine which party most aligns with that, and then find out who the electoral district association is in your riding that best reflects your desires for your community, for your city, for your province, and for your country. If there is more that you want to do politically, I think that's a great place to start. So that's a very practical thing that I would share with you. Here in Saskatchewan, We are a small population spread out over a huge geographic region. And we can't wait to do what we should do until we have to, right? We understand the importance of being in community. And I think that it is that understanding that you are part of a community, that you are part of something bigger than yourself. That's an essential part in starting you on the path of determining how you want to be involved and interact with it. I became a Christian when I was 12 years old, when I was turning 12 years old. And that had the most profound influence on how I viewed the world and how I chose to interact with it. And I have to say that I am so grateful for the fact that it was during those years of faith, when I was young, that I had made that decision, because that truly guided my decision making. And that is also when I became a part of a spiritual family in my community. You know, it wasn't until much later, though, that I began to understand and ask myself where we as believers fit, knowing that we are challenged to be in the world but not of the world, and how we fulfill our purpose, not only as individuals, but in the church. I think those are things that we struggle with as individuals and as the church. And boiled down, I think I have come to the conclusion and believe it is the following. First, we are commanded to love God and love others. We are commanded to be salt and light, Matthew 5:13-16. We are commanded to go into all the world and make disciples. And if we, the church, focus on these things, we will have the most profound impact, not only in your community or in your city or in your province, country, but perhaps even in the world. I think one of the best ways that we can do this in community is I think, depicted very, very graphically in Jeremiah 29. And we know the very they're all famous verses. But the verse that says, I know the plans I have for you. I back up a little bit and I go to verses 5 and 7, because I think this really has solidified in my mind what we need to do as believers. The challenge of being in the world but not of the world. But Jeremiah was giving a message to the people of Judah, and here's what he said. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. So from that, I get that we need to be in community. We need to participate in the life of the community. We need to participate in the commerce and the economy of the community. We need to be salt and light. And however you define community, we are to be salt and light and be participating in that community. Recently, I heard the following phrase. I heard it perhaps a year ago, and then I heard it again most recently this past week. Politics is downstream from society, and society is downstream from faith. Now think about that. Politics is downstream from society. So you will get the government you deserve as a society. And what better way to impact for a church to have an impact on society than to be being salt and light? One of the most important ways to have an impact, I believe, is to pray for your leaders. In fact, praying for our elected officials is not an option. We are commanded to do that throughout Scripture. And I just want to share a couple of scriptures with you. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Another one in 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is very familiar, I'm sure. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and what? Heal their land. You know, the reality is that you and I are living in what is considered to be a post-Christian nation. And this shift has happened over the past 4 or 5 decades, over my lifetime. Or put another way, we are more and more a secular society. Now, I looked up the definition of secularism because I do that. I do like to know what I'm talking about. Secularism is a belief system that religion should not be a part of the affairs of the state or part of public education. And I have to tell you that I firmly believe that one of the most misunderstood concepts is the phrase, the separation of church and state. Secularism embraces the principles of separation of church and state and keeping religion out of the public sphere. I know that that phrase was paraphrased from a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson way back in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut. I think far too many people interpret that phrase to mean today that politics must be protected from religion, when in fact I believe it was established to protect the church from government. And I think that's something we need to remember. And this notion, the separation of church and state, is nowhere to be found in our Constitution. Instead, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is robust in its description as it lists the freedom of religion and or belief as one of our fundamental rights here in Canada. It's part of our Charter, Section 2, under the heading of Fundamental Freedoms, states, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the freedom of the press and other media of communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. Now, my concern is that as we are increasingly becoming a more secular society, that we begin to interpret secularism to mean freedom from religion, not freedom of religion. And this is something that I have spent a fair bit of time working with through an organization called IPP4B. I think to boil this down now and bring this back to focus on what our role is and our responsibilities, I think we all need to go all the way back to the beginning. And so in order to bring this into perhaps what we are doing here this morning, encouraging women, encouraging all of you to make your voices heard, I want us to take a look at Genesis 1:26-28. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." I had the great fortune back in 2008 of hearing Lisa Bevere speak. And I think it was that year that her book, Fight Like a Girl, was published. How many of you have read the book, Fight Like a Girl? Okay, not too many hands going up. I would recommend that you read this book. It changed me and changed my perspective in terms of my role as a female, and a female who was about to enter into the political realm. In her book, Fight Like a Girl, Lisa Bevere says this: gender was one of God's creative ways of expressing diversity within unity. She goes on to say it was God himself who declared it not good for his glorious man Adam to be alone. Likewise, it is not good for the woman to remain hidden within the image of the man. Eve was a necessary addition to creation. She had a role to play. She had a purpose. And if we believe that woman was a necessary addition to creation, then it stands to reason that we do have purpose. And I do believe, that women are wired differently than men and bring a different perspective to the table. And I think that we need to understand those differences, but also embrace that those differences are within unity. Understanding our purpose and the resulting influence we have is key to making our voices known. Recently, I was asked if women can change federal politics. My first thought was a question in itself: do they want to? I think this is something that we need to ask ourselves, and I think that's what we're being challenged to do here this morning. Women have been making a difference throughout history, whether we look to the Bible for those women. And some of those examples, I think we talked about Esther, Rahab, Deborah, Abigail, Esther, or to international role models like Sister Teresa, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the longest-serving First Lady of the United States, described as an American political figure, diplomat, and activist. She was a U.S. delegate to the United Nations, and she was instrumental in formulating the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Rosa Parks, she was an American activist, known for her role in the Montgomery bus boycott. She is described as the First Lady of Civil Rights. Margaret Thatcher, one of my personal heroes. Malala Yousafzai, we're all familiar with Malala. Or right here within our own borders, as I mentioned earlier, the famous Five, or Viola Desmond, a Canadian civil rights activist and businesswoman who challenged racial segregation at a cinema in Nova Scotia. She is now featured on our $10 bill. We see women who remembered who they are, who they were created to be, and what they were created to do. Psalm 139, for you created me, you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Talk about purpose. In closing, I was just in Washington, D.C. this past week. In fact, I got in at about midnight, quarter after midnight this morning, and I was really concerned that I wasn't going to get here. If you look at my phone, I have 11 notifications from Air Canada. Every flight that we were taking was being delayed. And so I really wondered if the Lord wanted me here this morning. But he did, because I managed to make my connections from Washington, D.C. to Toronto. I was attending the second annual Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, and it was being hosted by the U.S. State Department. And the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, kicked it off. We heard from numerous individuals from around the world, delegates from around the world attended, and we were there, obviously, to address the issues of religious freedom and persecution, and freedom from persecution as a result of your religious beliefs. I not only attended the ministerial, but I had the opportunity to visit a number of museums in the city of Washington, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Museum of the Bible. And you know, you do not visit these museums without being confronted with the stories of people who made a difference in the course of their nation. Individuals, men and women, who believed that they could make a difference. And as I read some of those stories against the backdrop of a movement or historical events, I was struck with the thought that these were ordinary individuals who managed to do extraordinary things. They understood, perhaps, if they were men and women of faith, that we are all called to be ministers of the gospel. And I also came to understand, and I think it was already shared this morning as well in some of the examples, you may never know the difference that you have made by standing up for what you believe, or by taking that step, or by doing that one small thing. I certainly didn't when I said yes to serving on a playground committee. And I would say that that is probably one of the things that got me started on this path to becoming a member of Parliament and standing in front of you today. So I just want to encourage you in that. I want to encourage you with what I've shared. I want to encourage you that that one small thing that God is calling you to do, it's the first step that may lead to many other steps. And even if it doesn't, as long as we're obedient to doing that one small thing, you may never know the difference that you've made. Thank you.